Welcome to Drugs Unwrapped, the podcast, brought to you by Barod. Barod is a substance use service based across West, South and East Wales. Each episode will be asking one question about drugs and their use and debating it from the perspectives of those at the front line, providing support and services to those affected by substances. Welcome to Drugs Unwrapped, the brand new podcast by Barod. I'm Rob, and each episode we'll be asking a question and debating it from the perspectives of services and treatment. So with me today is Sarah, who is the young person's Gwent N-Gage service manager, and Jamie, who is the service manager for our Swansea services. How are we doing both? You okay?
Great, thank you.
I'm good, thank you. Happy to be in Swansea today.
Good. So our question today, we'll just crack on. So for the first ever podcast, our question today is drug use an acceptable part of growing up? Jamie, first of all, what's your initial thoughts?
I think that what we as an organisation look at and accept of is that like drug use can be a part of adolescence for some individuals, but it's important to note that not adolescents engage in drug use. Adolescence is like a period which is like significant physical, emotional and social changes. I think that's really kind of like important to kind of highlight. And some young people may only experiment with drugs as they navigate these transitions of adolescence. So you hear common themes such as like peer pressure, but I also think there needs to be a conversation and discussion around like peer preference as well, and you know how cultures, subcultures within youth culture as a whole has an influence, and sometimes drug use is a part of that. So it's not always that you see drug use and peer pressure is the main contributory factor to young persons kind of like drug use during those phases of adolescence, shall we say.
Yeah. So your initial thoughts in terms of, and also in terms of what Jamie said?
Yeah, absolutely agree with what Jamie said there. I think when we think about the term acceptable, I think that's quite a difficult term to think about when we're talking about young people, because actually who are we to make that judgment on what is and what isn't acceptable? I think to pick up on Jamie's point, certainly it's more around whether it's actually an inevitable part of adolescence. And I think for me, drug use is an inevitable part of adolescence to some degree, but it's very much on a spectrum. I think, for some young people that might be actually just as low level as having some exposure to substances, becoming more aware of substances around them, being aware of peers using substances, to moving up to a slightly higher level of perhaps experimenting with substances, to then those that choose to use on a more recreational, regular basis, to then young people that are absolutely entrenched in substance use where there are a lot of complex needs. So I think it is an inevitable part of adolescence, but just very much on a varying spectrum. And certainly, what we see in service is all aspects of that. We see young people from all different parts of that spectrum, and how we respond to that would be very different depending on where that young person is at.
Yeah. Do you think in terms of like, you talk about exposure, and obviously like we live in a social media kind of frenzy, really, don't we, in terms of like it's probably odd if certain people aren't on social media. I say odd, but like there's better words out there. But do you think in terms of that has kind of played just a massive part and kind of stepped it up really in terms of the exposure to young people with drugs?
I think it's one part of the puzzle. Yeah. I think it's an element of that exposure. It's certainly an area that wasn't part of my adolescence and growing up, but that's not to say that I didn't experience exposure to substances when I was younger. I think social media has just been added into the mix, and I think predominantly that can be a negative exposure in terms of more accessibility to substances, more contacts, more connections with people that are involved in substances. But there are some elements where it's not necessarily negative. So there are some really good social media pages that actually aim to give harm reduction support and advice. So I think, social media does get a really bad press, and yes, it does play a part in increasing that exposure, but doesn't necessarily always need to be seen in a bad light.
I think going on the back of what Sarah's saying is that as a service provider, providing support, harm reduction support services to young people, I think for us it's important to distinguish between the different types of drug use. And if you categorise different kinds of drug use, not all drug use, including we've got to talk about alcohol as well here.
Absolutely, yeah.
Whereby then you've got to look at the context. That isn't always social media led and bound. That's societal, environmental, etc. And I think for us, from those kind of like lower risk drugs that we would consider, which just to name but a few, would be such substances like alcohol, tobacco, marijuana, should we say, those kind of substances which, due to our prohibitionist approach within the law, with regards to regulatory elements to alcohol and tobacco, and then the legality element to cannabis, I think it's important that we look and engage with individuals who would be deemed as experimental use at that point, with that risk of those other substances becoming more frequently used because of other things such as availability. And availability also plays a huge part with the social media element, with how you can, create a congregation or a gathering of people to come together with commonalities and themes, which then not necessarily was brought to the attention by the social media from the drug use perspective, but enabling people to come together with common themes and common likes, shall we say. But I think the other element then for us is that accepting that young people, knowing or maybe not accepting from a legality perspective, that young people will engage in riskier behaviours involving other what would be termed as illegal substances, which has then, there's an increase in the severity and the frequency of the drug use can vary widely among some of those young people. And because of the legality element and not having any kind of possibility or means of knowing what substances people are using or young people are using today, the risk factors are increased tenfold, and it's how we deliver those messages to young people and what vehicle we see in is impactive and creative as well, because the creative element and content moves fast in our area of work these days, and it's quite impressive sometimes to see what how that kind of like links into the psyche of a young person and going through adolescence.
Yeah, and I think it's important as well, like you guys mentioned, in terms of actually first of all, what drugs are we talking about? Because if you think about alcohol and cigarettes and vaping and stuff, like to a certain degree, I would say there's an element of acceptability about that. You look at, for example, like certain coming of age kind of milestones, like 18, you're like, okay, that's when you can go to the pub legally. But like, it's kind of like, that's something people look forward to potentially at that age. Whereas again, in terms of if you're kind of just flip the conversation and talk about, say, cocaine or MDMA, then that conversation can go very differently in terms of purely because of the type of actual drug that you're talking about. From your perspectives then, in terms of like, so what are the common like substances you see within like your young person's services? So Jamie, if we come to you, like what's What are the main drugs within the young people that you're seeing
I think we, breaking it down into age, our services are delivered from 11 to 25 in our locality, but we are having requests to look and work with younger people within Key Stage 2, predominantly within Year 6, so that transitional period of going from primary school settings into secondary education. And what we're seeing is an increase in demand for drug and alcohol information advice around alcohol, tobacco, cannabis, and also vaping. Now we've got to include in that as well, especially with the availability of vapes containing THC and CBD, and also the media element of the popularity of those topics around CBD and THC, and people being more aware of the effects and the benefits from the intoxication element. So we see more commonly those substances up until the age of 12, 13, 14, and then we see an increase of alcohol use, actual alcohol use increasing to quite hazardous levels, and then also the inclusion of such drugs as MDMA, ketamine, and crack cocaine as well. But we've got to think, across the areas that we do deliver our services, we've got very different drug cultures, but also there's lots of nuances and similarities there as well, which we've got to kind of accept. I think for us, it's like we've seen that element of when working with adolescents, that we try to tap into that, depending on their age, setting, is their asking them, discussing their curiosity about substances. That kind of desire for independence kind of comes out, and the need for that self-expression through the use of substances, and also self-medication as well, for those individuals that may be diagnosed or undiagnosed with ASD or ADHD, etc. So there's many factors there that contribute to that kind of experimentation or the initiation of those substances. So it's quite fascinating to see the different types of drugs at different stages and different ages.
And so for you, in terms of what do you tend to see within your services?
So in Gwent, we've got a slightly different setup to Swansea. So our service is for under 18s, and then we've got a transitional team then that works specifically with our 18 to 21 year olds. And that service was kind of set up to bridge that gap between young persons and adult services in Gwent, to make sure there was a really sort of robust transition process. So interestingly, I find that on paper, what our service looks like we work with is quite different to what it is in reality. And what I mean by that is, so when we take a referral, we record what is classed as a primary substance, so the main substance, the reason that young person's being referred into service, or they've referred themselves, and then we'll have any secondary substances. And by far and beyond, the highest referral is always cannabis. It always has been, and that never changes. Quarter on quarter, it's always been cannabis as the primary, and then alcohol is sort of your second substance that comes up. But actually what we find is, when we do assessments and we explore that further with young people, that picture is often very different. And for us as a service, the work that we would focus on won't always necessarily be the cannabis. So for example, if we've got a young person that's referred in and they're using a small amount of cannabis every couple of days, but then they disclose in their assessment that they're actually drinking an excessive amount of alcohol on a Saturday night, what you would consider to be a binge drinking session, for me the priority there is to go in and do that piece of work around the alcohol use, because actually the risk levels associated with that are far higher. But I think what happens is, in terms of that acceptability around alcohol use, we don't see referrals tending to come in for a Saturday night alcohol binge session, because it's classed as normal, typical adolescent behaviour, and people don't they won't class cannabis every couple of days, a small amount, as normal, typical adolescent behaviour. So there's a lot more panic and worry and concern about it from parents, school. So we tend to see them come in for that, but actually when we explore, there's a lot more going on. Also, I think we find that once we build a rapport with young people, they might be more open and honest with us about other substances that they're using. So we often see, again, they might come in for regular cannabis use, but they don't disclose then to, you know, perhaps a teacher in school or their parents that are actually on a Saturday night using ketamine, cocaine and ecstasy. So again, our focus would be to go in to make sure they're having really key harm reduction information about using those substances before we would start to look at that cannabis use. So yeah, it's always been quite interesting for me because I report on to our commissioners our primary and secondary substances, but actually I feel like it's a much wider picture behind the scenes in terms of like our actual core data looks different to in reality what that looks like. And then also we do a lot of work with young people in schools that are not that we're not collecting any core data on, and so we get a lot of information around what's happening anecdotally. So when the engagement workers are out, also we've got training team, so they deliver training to professionals across Gwent. We get a lot of information from staff that attend that professionals training about what's happening, and I think, you know, the anecdotal information then really feeds into just what a wide spectrum of substances are being used across the board. I don't know if you see the same with that, Jamie.
I think it's a really interesting piece of work in relation to what impact does drug and alcohol information advice have on adolescents, and especially when, you know, linking in with PSE within the secondary schools, because if you think about like how many young people we actually have frontline face-to-face contact with, and how many say self-referrals are generated from that, and what are the benefits of delivering that kind of like drug and alcohol general information dissemination. Because it's interesting to see, and I'm talking probably from our services, we see very little return in regards to that. So you know, we have a mass, you know, dissemination of information through our harm reduction approach in delivering education sessions around drugs and alcohol, and we get very little self-referrals. So, you know, you'll get a referral from education if they deem that there's an issue or underlying issues with someone's drug and alcohol use, but the individual themselves, and I think maybe there's some work that needs to be done with drugs and alcohol services, so it's a responsibility of our own to kind of change that cultural acceptance of alcohol, but then that dissatisfaction around illicit drug use and how that stigma then creates those barriers. So why would you go to a drug and alcohol services, even though alcohol is in our name explicitly, but then for the drugs then that's a matter that's not up for discussion, is not on the table for discussion with young people. But I think we're combating then the constant strife, I suppose, we've got with the prohibitionist approach with drugs and alcohol, drugs in this country, and also the stigma and the labels attached to drug use of people and young people that then create those barriers. So we've got a huge task on ourselves for asking about services for adolescents to destigmatise and work in a non-judgmental way across all our services and all our partner agencies to allow us to be able to engage proactively and be able to plant those seeds of harm reduction techniques, skills, coping mechanisms for those young people to feel like they can just drop into a service at any point of their drug use, not feel labelled, not feel tagged, and then access services appropriately and timely. Because more often than not, when we see, should we say, more complex cases, it's because of that timeline that they've gone through to get to where they are today, and then we're almost this damage limitation and picking up the pieces, or the young person's become older and then has limited access then to treatment services. So, you know, sooner access or sooner, easier availability, which I know as an organisation we're trying and developing things such as web chat, accessibility to our services through social media content. And I think that's really important, how we tap that in. but it's a massive task for us to do that. But I think what services are really doing well, I think, Sarah, if you want to, you know, about the youth panels, you know, the consultation process is really important, and I don't know what are you finding, anything from regards to young people's feedback in relation to the services?
I think certainly from what I've learned since working in young person services, and I'm just continuing to learn on, and it's continuing to be sort of cemented in my mind, is the only way to deliver your service is the wider the flexibility of your service, the better. Because actually, I think what we are working with young people is such a wide, I know I've used this word a few times, spectrum, and no two young people that come into our service are the same. Like, their reasons for use are all so varied, what they're using, the combination of what they're using, their environments, the exposure that they've had, they're all so unique. And I think to try and meet those varying needs with a very strict prescriptive service just absolutely doesn't work. And I think what we've tried to do in Gwent is expand the flexibility of what we can offer, but I think there's still further to go with that. I think, you're still working within a commissioned service, and there's still certain expectations in terms of how you work and the process that you need to follow. And, there's an element of that you need to have in terms of boundaries and safety and risk management, etc. But actually, I think we need to widen it and make ourselves more open access, because I think that's the only way. And we've started to do this piece of work, like Jamie said, now with young people within the service, and we've developed a Engaging Ambassadors project. So we've got a range of young people from sort of different strands of our service that have formed this group, and that is the sense that I'm getting from young people. It's about actually, this Monday to Friday 9 to 5 approach is not fit for purpose for us. Saturdays I'm really struggling when I feel really isolated. I'm in, alternative education provision Monday to Friday, so I've got a sense of purpose those days. It's Saturday and Sunday that I really struggle, and that's when I need the support. That's when I need somebody that I can talk to. So it's about just thinking outside the box a bit more, and trying to offer your services in the widest possible sense, and making it open access in a true sense. I think we're starting to look at like the way our buildings are set up, and they're just very still too restrictive. I think we need to be much more open to meet all of those varying different needs.
Yeah, it's not 9 to 5. Like, and you think in terms of, especially with young people, again, you both will know much better than myself, but if you're talking about, say, 14, 15, 16-year-olds, majority are going to be in school. And obviously that's when services are open. So, you're looking at kind of like in the evenings, in the nighttime economy as well, obviously, if you're going a little bit older as well. But like, to pick up on what you said though, Sarah, like what are the reasons, like why are young people using drugs? You said it really varies like from person to person, but are there kind of like common themes that you do come across? And also, is it like, do you tend to see a common theme in terms of why people use a certain drug compared to others, if you get what I mean?
I think it's very unique to the young person. I think we do see sort of themes and patterns coming through, but I think I like to see it as a unique story for every young person, and I think that we need to tailor the support that we offer to that uniqueness, absolutely. But certainly, it's experiencing trauma is a key one for young people that are particularly our kind of more complex young people that are experiencing lots of challenges. We have parental substance use, exposure with peers, exposure with siblings. It could be accessibility in the area that you're living in. It could be self-esteem. I think you mentioned earlier, self-medicating, young people experiencing challenges with additional learning needs and that not being appropriately supported and managed. I think, actually it can be an option for young people to self-soothe, to help themselves feel better. It could be, an inappropriate relationship that they're in. It could be exploitation, criminal exploitation. It could be sexual exploitation. It is so varied, and it can be a combination of all of those factors. It can be a combination of a few. I think you just need to be really open to learning from that young person what their story is and understanding from them what it's about, and that's when you can do some really good work with them.
Do you see something similar, Jane?
Yeah, I think what Sarah was just saying is quite an extensive list.
Yeah.
I think it's a catch-all, and there's as also said, there's no two individuals are the same. And I think what we kind of like battle with, and we touched on like the media's influence, and like from films to music, drugs feature quite highly. Even the names of some musicians these days include the use of different types of drugs, etc. And there's cultures, and we've seen the increase of certain substances alongside certain cultures. If you go as far back as the 90s with the ecstasy generation, and how that was massively influenced by electronic music, and that's still around today. And and it's outlasted and outlived most other subcultures within youth and society today. And I think you've got to look at where we are at this moment in time, and the stresses and strains and pressures on families and adolescents. And as I was explaining, all those kind of like that self-expression is sometimes a need and an outlet for young people. The increased exposure to, as we see on the news, from free parties and the use of different substances, particularly stimulants, during the summer months and the festival period. We see more people indulging in a variety of different substances because their environment and their setting has changed, and that's kind of really important, that we've got that kind of fluidity to be able to keep up with the demands and the changes, and for us to be credible in the actual information that we provide to those individuals. I often liken it, and I don't know whether you agree, but like when you see like sexual health and health promotion, and how the accessibility to sexual health screening, there doesn't seem to be so much of a taboo and stigma in accessing those services like there was maybe 10, 15, 20 years ago. And is there something from that we can potentially take from that to be able to mould and adapt our services? The only difference is that you're not up against the Substance Use Act, the illegal element to it, which has its constraints, obviously, in how we deliver services, such as like front of house drug testing services, to be almost normalised, to link in and with like the contextual safeguarding elements that are in existence within our society when you're looking at extra familiar harms. And I think we are starting as a country, and as particularly in Wales and in our localities, are getting that right because of the amount of expertise and joint working practices that's been developing, that we are starting to create an enhanced environment whereby young people who may be experiencing all those issues that Sarah's alluded to can access at different times to get the support. But what you tend to find is that it's not always then explicitly drug and alcohol service, the generic youth service provisions, but if we can be like tagged on to that and support that, but coming in through the back door, should we say, that you can provide that support without the stigma attached to it. Because when we're talking about having like an entity or a body or a service which is a designated building, there's still that issue about people crossing the threshold and coming in and getting that support because of that stigma. And stigma, the way people looks, the way people are, they want to come across in communities. If you're living in a community and a service is on your doorstep, that is a barrier in itself to be able to access services. So things such as web chat, phone line communications, all those kind of things do assist then to help those individuals make up their mind when and where is a good time for them to access the service. You can never take anything away from that face-to-face contact. Obviously, you know, it's always that's the consummate element to the best kind of form of delivering a provision. However, those other means of contacting are modern day kind of challenges for us older people, but that's the way the things are moving now, is that's how people can communicate or feel confident in being able to communicate, and that's where our strengths got to, you know, we got to increase our strengths and keep on adapting to those demands.
Yeah. And also, just to pick up on that, I think having those options feel like you're expanding your options of safe ways of communicating as well, because I do think there is still that fear of being open and honest about substance use, particularly because there's still that illegal substance use dilemma that, you know, particularly for young people as well. And I think probably that puts a lot of it underground or not openly talked about, you know, and I think we need to be working towards bringing that out as an open conversation as much as possible. And I think it's a million times better than it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, but I think there's still a long way to go for that and still a lot of work for us to do around that.
Because the risks have never changed.
No, absolutely.
The risks are still there because, and in fact, I think, you know, fast forward to today, in relation to the comparison of like 10, 20 years ago, we didn't have the added complexities of, you know, new and emerging drugs, which I think, you know, our systems have created those marketplaces and have really upped the ante, and it also makes our work as harm reductionists really complex in how do you deliver that information as a catch-all for a whole host of variety of different substances which are potentially being, you know, touted as a old traditional substance such as MDMA or ecstasy, benzodiazepines, etc. So those are really kind of like challenging times for us and have been since the emergence of you know, new psychoactive substances. And that issue hasn't gone away, even though the new psychoactive substance law came into play. That hasn't improved the current situation for young people who are still actively involved in using different substances. So it still brings up a lot of challenges for us as services, and how do we respond to things and emerging drugs when we don't know what they are, what the long-term effects are, but we know why those substances are available. So that's the question we've got to ask lawmakers then, to see what are the real benefits, because we're seeing reports now that drug use is actually increasing, availability is increasing, and we know, and we have the answers to some of that, not all of it, but we kind of like see the rationale behind why people are using. Yeah, particularly young people.
And that feels like, it's growing more and more and more, like the amount of substances that are available and the different versions of all of those substances just seems to get bigger and bigger and bigger. So like Jamie said, that makes our job more and more challenging, absolutely.
And I think, you know, from us then, and I don't like using the word prevention, because I think if we say we're going to prevent drug use, I think we're setting ourselves up to fail because of all the reasons that we just said. But I think, you know, the efforts that we make in relation to like education, creating supportive environments, and trying our best then to access such as mental health resources are absolutely crucial in addressing drug use amongst adolescents. But I think part of our role, which is really really pertinent, should we say, in the delivery of our services, is to, like, you know, give adolescents the opportunities to increase and encourage like healthy coping mechanisms, fostering open communication, promoting positive relationships amongst themselves and with others, to be able to address any issues or challenges that may be in the way, and then providing accurate information about the risks associated with the substances that are used, and all importantly, like the strategies to support adolescents in making informed decision making about their health and well-being.
In terms of like what you're both saying then, is like the legality of certain drugs plays a massive part in terms of, that's just something that I've kind of picked up on obviously lots of different things. Like, I think you both mentioned it in terms of, as services, when you are talking with like those other kind of like partner organizations, and when they're referring like young people into services, there seems to be more panic when it's kind of like illegal drugs compared to like the legals. So cannabis versus alcohol, like from your perceptions and from your beliefs, and ultimately in terms of like from your understanding, kind of working with young people and other kind of professionals that work with young people, like where do those fears come from? Is it purely down to like the legality, that people just believe because cannabis is illegal, it is therefore more harmful, it's more, there's a lot more risks associated to it? Is that kind of like your both understanding, like says that, or is there something else like at play there in terms of?
Yeah, I think that the legality does play a big part in that, and I think it's almost a bit of a fear as well. I find when we get referrals from external services, some are brilliant, and I think, some services have really come a long way and have got a much better understanding. But it's still, there is still a sense of some referrals we get in are because, a professional has found out that a young person has used a substance, and I think they panic. There's a fear and they're scared because they don't understand it. And then what I think tends to happen is then that referral comes in almost as this is an issue because an illegal substance is being used. We need you to deal with this young person. Yeah. And it feels like it's not come from the right place, and actually that professional perhaps hasn't sat down and explored with that young person what that substance use is about. Whereas I think there would be more of a openness to have a conversation if it was alcohol, even cannabis. I think people are a bit more liberal about their thoughts around cannabis, so they may sort of delve into a conversation about that. But anything other than that, there's a fear and there's a panic, and it's like, oh, we need somebody else to deal with that immediately. I don't know, do you get that?
Yeah, I think there's so many different strands that we could discuss, that looking at the emphasis is purely on the illegality element to it, and the potential of, as simple things of having a criminal record which has career detrimental impacts on that young person, going on into adulthood and choosing a career or travelling, and that sometimes can be used then as the big stick to say scare off individuals from using substances. And like we go back to the conversation about changing the culture of and the acceptance of illegal drug use as we see it, but that's always then backed up by, should we say, some science element to it, whereby you're constantly told about the adolescent brain is still developing, and the substance can interfere with normal brain development, leading to long-term negative effects on cognition, decision making and mental health. And additionally, like, substance use during adolescence then is sometimes associated with an increased risk of developing drug and alcohol use later on in life. So when you're told that as a bit of a scare tactic, those fears within like professional domains are always there and will always be used. But we want the minutiae, we want the governments will lead us to recognise the therapeutic elements as well. So you've got that balanced perspective on the information that we're given and what we can act on. And I think that's vital, and it's massively important, and it needs to be broken down to each drug and each stage of an individual's life with the necessary evidence base, because that's what we need to be working from, is an evidence base, and then that information is pulled together and put into digestible, bite-sized components that people, no matter where you are, no matter what walk of life you're in, can use that information in action, on action. So it's up to that individual to make the decisions made on evidence-based scientific information about the different substances. And we know what alcohol does to young people and what it does to people later on in life, and how much impact it has on society in general. But yeah, alcohol is still kind of available, and culturally it is kind of accepted worldwide almost, and many cultures have different approaches to how they use and we use alcohol in the United Kingdom. So there's so many different strands and elements to that. It's a huge kind of debate to unpick and embroil to be able to find the best approach. And obviously each individual that we come into contact with, as Sarah said earlier on, you need a tailor-made approach for each young person that we come into contact with, and do that targeted support which meets their needs in a psychologically informed and trauma-informed way.
I remember when I was a young person's worker, so this is going to be like over 10 years ago, and like you mentioned about like the impact that, like, say, a criminal record will have, in terms of obviously if they're caught kind of in possession of illegal drugs. I always remember there was these two lads, and they were marched in by one of their dads, and literally I think maybe the day or two before, they were with a group of mates, and the police basically came along, and I think they got these two lads, everybody else had scarpered, but and I remember they were being marched in, and they said they'd been caught with 1 gram of cannabis, which I think most people may think that's not a huge amount, but you could just see they were quite terrified, and they were a bit like, what am I doing, like a drug service, but the implications that would potentially have then on the rest of their lives, in terms of, because it wouldn't just say a gram of cannabis, it would say like possession of Class B drug, wouldn't it, on their criminal record. And then obviously the implications, they must have been, it's quite a few years ago obviously now, but they must have been about 16, 17. So they were probably, in a couple of years, maybe thinking about going travelling and stuff like that. And, just that one instance of potentially they're not causing any harm to anybody, and just the kind of the prohibition kind of stance that we have, on certain drugs, specifically in this case with cannabis, potentially could have a real detrimental effect really on the rest of their lives. And I think for me, in terms of the question being, is it acceptable part of growing up? I think it's really hard to kind of answer that question, because I think first and foremost, when you're young, you feel invincible. But also I've always taken that perspective that it is the time to take risks, whatever risks those are, because that's how you find your own limits. That's kind of how you find who you are to a degree, what you enjoy as well. You could take, for example, an extreme sport, and I probably think skateboarding's extreme for I'm so risk averse myself, but it doesn't matter really what behavior or anything, I think people are always going to take risks, especially at kind of a young person kind of age, and I think as you get older, your priorities and your responsibilities change, so therefore you are going to become potentially more risk averse. So, but I do think it comes down to, specific drugs, because I think, you look at, say, an 18-year-old who's going to university is so kind of orientated in terms of the activities around alcohol, in terms of like the sports clubs. It's just, you play your game, but then like literally you got your socials like every couple of every other day, so to speak, and it's all centered around alcohol with that, and obviously that's okay, that's nowhere near frowned upon as if exactly the same scenario, but they're all going to go and do lines of cocaine. The perception, I think, would be completely different. And for me, when I strip it all the way back, it's to do with the legality aspect of it, because there's been quite a few famous bits of research. Obviously, David Nutt a few years ago, and there's one that's just come out in New Zealand, that actually found alcohol, again, is the most harmful drug, and I think for me, it just always comes back to the legality. And obviously there's other elements in play, obviously with the likes of illegal drugs, you don't know what they're necessarily kind of also have in them, if they're contaminated, for example, and in terms of dilutants and stuff like that. But that's what it always comes back to for me. One thing I wanted, before we finish, one thing I really wanted to ask you guys is kind of similar in terms of like, that kind of panic that potentially you kind of get that perception with kind of like schools and other kind of like young persons services that you liaise with. But what's the conversation like with parents? So if you've got like concerned parents who come to you and say, my kid is using cannabis, or my kid, has tried ketamine or whatever, how does that conversation go, and generally just how is it for you? Because obviously we take a very harm reduction approach, and I would say we don't condemn, but we don't condone drug use. How are those conversations? Because I could imagine that you got a very potentially scared parent in front of you who's saying, oh my days, my kid's smoking cannabis, and it's a gateway drug and they're going to go on and use other drugs and stuff like that. Sarah, if we come to you first, like, how does that conversation go, and how do you feel in terms of within that conversation?
Yeah, so really interestingly, in Gwent, we had a family support service where we were working with young people affected by others' substance use. And probably about 2 years ago, one of the workers that focused on that piece of work came to myself and the team leader to have a conversation about branching that out to offer support specifically for parents of young people using substances, because what we were finding was that there were lots of cases where the workers were going and doing some work with the young person, and the parents were desperate to be either involved in that support or to have information about what was actually happening in those sessions. And obviously you want to protect that time for that young person. You want them to be able to feel that they can be really open and honest and have that confidential space. But actually we recognised that there was a place to play for parents to be involved in that. And we'd done it informally, I think, as we've been delivering the contract, but never formalised it. So we put together a bit of a pilot and started to offer a specific support service for parents of young people using substances. And it's worked so well. So we get a lot of take up for it. And I think, the feedback from the workers that pick up those cases say that a large part of the work that they do is around explaining the concept of harm reduction, so that parents can understand what that actually means and how that translates in terms of how they can offer that support within the family. They often do lots of work around communication, boundaries, ensuring that they've still got boundaries in place, safeguarding, because actually when we're looking at somebody under the age of 18, we've still got to consider making sure that young person is safe, and you've got the parental responsibility around that. But certainly a big focus is around harm reduction. And one of our activities workers, actually not a family worker, did a piece of work a few months ago when I was asking for a case study for our report, and he sent a letter that she'd written to him through to me, and it was amazing because in that letter it actually said, when my young person initially started working with you, I very much wanted you to come at it as a just say no approach. And after working with this worker and getting an understanding that actually just that approach doesn't work, I now understand what you mean by harm reduction. The young person is still using cannabis on a regular basis, but actually we've been able to support him with accessing college, making sure that he's using it in the safest possible way that he is. So yeah, I think it's a really important conversation to have. It can be really challenging, and I think I'm talking about best case scenario when you've got a parent open to having that conversation. Often we work with lots of young people where we just don't have any access to parents, and that's where it can be really difficult.
Yeah.
So
what about for you, Joe?
I think it's about as a lot of things come down to finance and economy of scales, and what we have to be is resourceful. So we really have to explore in a strengths-based approach in regards to recovery capital. And if you look at an individual's recovery capital, the three main kind of strength elements are increase someone's stability or reduces risk and increases the harm reduction elements of that individual's exposure and use of different drugs. Is like the person themselves, the social and the community elements. So having those positive relationships, whether it's with a blood relative or feeling that you're supported within your community, is a resource that is vital for us to be able to tap into, because then that kind of adds that additionality for not being self-reliant on services, but dependent on your networks. And those networks being there are obviously a huge part in, increasing stability. We're not going to be able to diminish all risk. And if risk exposure or episodes of any kind of particular harm is encountered, because of the nature of that happening any time of the day and year, then having that immediate access to supportive network is hugely important. So you're not just talking about then the individual's internal healthy coping mechanisms, but you're also having them being able to develop and foster an open communication, but that being a two-way process, that you can have that open dialogue about drug and alcohol use and the impacts of that within adolescence. So it's really important that we also educate our communities to make them aware that it's not just like what you read in the media and the stigma attached, and that everything to do with drugs is associated to crime. So I think that's a huge burden off the individuals who may be encountering struggles with their drug use at that time within their environment, within their social network. Because that can be a huge, that could have a real positive outcome for them. And like we're saying, because of the way communication, social media has changed now, people can reach out for support at a touch of a button, at a dialing of a number, if you have accessibility to those kind of if you are digitally connected. But we also got to be aware that there's many people who are not. So it's that personal touch, and which is also vitally important. That it's not just an online chat or a phone line. It's got that a bit more additionality to it, and has other elements to it as well.
Yeah.
And there are lots of resources out there now for parents and carers as well. And I think it's about making sure we're widening that access for information, so that there's that opportunity to have accurate information about substances, to try and break down some of those barriers and to try and sort of reduce some of that fear, and so that parents feel comfortable to have that conversation. And I think one thing that we found, just to pick up on this really quickly, is that we get lots of referrals for young people into service from parents because they're worried, and I get it because I'd probably be exactly the same. And the young person doesn't want to work with us, you know.
Yeah.
We're a voluntary organisation. We can't, you know, we're not statutory. We're not there to force anything. But having that opportunity then to say, look, the young person doesn't consent to working with us, but we can do a few sessions with you, we found has been really invaluable, because actually that information that we would have directly given to the young person then can be given by the parent, who spends so much more time with that young person. You know, we could offer an hour a week at best, you know. So I think it's a really positive way of working with young people. It doesn't work in every family dynamic, because we are, as you know, Jamie, we have some really complex family dynamics that we work with, but where that is an option, I think it's a really good thing for us to encourage.
Yeah, and I think you make a really good point there in terms of like just generally not just young people but adults and services as a whole. A lot of the time services will only provide support maybe for an hour a week, an hour every 2 weeks, depends how busy the service is. It may be like even more infrequent than that. And I think like what you said, Jamie, you know, in terms of like that kind of community support as well, you know, it's really kind of like pivotal, kind of having lots of different kind of strands that are available to not just young people, but, and I think, like you said, you know, if you're able to kind of inform the parents, so to speak, because they do spend obviously a lot more time with those young people.
And I think we have to be really realistic in terms of that, what we can offer. You know, we want to be able to go in and offer, you know, really robust, intensive support around young people or adults that we're working with, but that we just don't have capacity to do that. So I see our role as coming in and supporting an individual to pick apart what their needs are, and then facilitating that and supporting them to access all of those support needs from a wide variety of options. We're just a small part in that puzzle, and we might help to pull that all together, but, you know, it's about, we're not there to you know, we're not a magic wand service, unfortunately. You know, we're not set up to do that. We're just there to assist and bring everything together for that individual.
Yeah, cool. So just to wrap up now, I'm going to ask you both a question, and it's literally the topic today. So just 1-2 words. Jamie, for you, is drug use an acceptable part of growing up? Yes or no?
I would say we have to accept that. Not in 1 or 2 words, but yes, it is acceptable. But I think we are responsible to reduce those risks, and that lies on everyone. You know, from policymakers right down to frontline services. So not 2 words.
So wise, Joe. Sarah, for you?
I come back to what I said at the beginning. I think I couldn't possibly say what is and isn't acceptable for somebody in terms of their choices, but I think that, yes, it is an inevitable part for the majority of adolescents.
I like how he changed inevitable.
Yeah.
Nice. Cool. Well, thank you both for joining us. And till next time, we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.